Hello students, welcome to week 3 in COM308 Interpersonal Communication. I want to go over some things that we have going on this week, as well as highlighting some of the most pertinent information from the course text. So looking at our week 3 agenda, it's important to see that we're reading 2 chapters this week. We are going through chapter 4, which is on listening, and chapter 5, which is on communicating with words, and usually getting into some speaking and things like that, but looking more at language rather than the art of speaking itself. So those are our chapter readings right there. We do have a number of different videos that we will be watching in our watch section. These videos are designed to enhance your experience in applying what we've read to some other areas of the course content. So there's some TED Talks on ways to listen better, ways to listen, learn, and lead, three ways the brains create meaning, and then another video on language and identity and how they're connected. So these videos are really designed for you after you've gone through this lecture, you've read the course content, and you really start to understand what listening and communicating with words means according to Gamble and Gamble. Now we're going to read some content, we're going to watch some content, that helps explain that further and really enhances our learning when it comes to that. When we get into our Learn section, you will have your first interpersonal observation report due, as well as one discussion board. So remember that discussion board posts are due on Friday, your original post, and on Sunday your replies are due. And then your interpersonal observation report itself will be due on Sunday. So as we look through some of the course content, let's take a look at what this interpersonal observation report requires. You'll be doing 3 of these throughout the semester, and in a nutshell, what I'm asking you to do is to observe interpersonal interactions. So what that means is I want you to go to some particular place. It could be a park, it could be a mall, it could be a library, you could be at a sporting event. It really could be virtually anywhere. But in each report, the place has to be unique to that report. So if you go to a park and observe some people interacting, you can't do that again in report 2 or 3. So keep that in mind. Each time you do this report, you have to observe it in a different setting. It could be at home. You could be observing your children interacting with one another. You could observe your parents. You could be at a family party. So think outside the box. Don't think of this as something that you have to make time to observe something outside of your normal situations that you deal with on a weekly basis. It could be observing 2 coworkers eating lunch in the break room. It could be observing a family interact at your child's sporting event. So think about that. The point is that you'll complete 3 things, and when in those 3 things, you're going to first observe some type of interpersonal interaction for at least 10 minutes. Ideally, if you could observe the people for an hour is ideal, but if all you can get is 10 to 20 minutes, that's fine. You have to observe them for a significant amount of time to, 1, be able to identify the type of interpersonal interaction. So what are you observing? Somebody listening to someone else, somebody speaking to somebody else, some relational dialectics, how these relations are, the people's relationships are interacting with one another. You have to be able to identify what that is. 2, you do not have to let them know. You can kind of just observe from afar and go from there. Normally when this class is taught in a face-to-face setting, we actually spend a class period going during lunch and sitting there and observing just people and going from there with that. So keep that in mind. You don't have to let them know. So for this report, you're going to reserve particularly listening and speaking for sure, and then kind of going beyond there if you want to dive deeper. Since this week we're talking about listening and communicating with words, it might be good to observe somebody's listening habits, looking at 2 people interacting to see what each other is doing to show that they're listening to one another based off of what the chapter said. After you've observed that, make sure you take some handwritten notes and things like that, or type some notes on your phone or whatever that might be. You're going to write a report that includes your observations, comparison to what the text says about the interpersonal behavior you're observing, and tell me what you found. What are the communication behaviors and what are the findings? And go in there and become your own interpersonal communication scholar and determine, I observed these people and I saw that according to the Sapir and Wolf hypothesis of language, they were doing this, this, and this, or whatever it may be. Your report will be in full APA, so whenever I say APA, just naturally assume that's a cover page, abstract, and reference pages and such, and it'll be no less than 350 words. So about 3/4 of a page or so. You'll find though to thoroughly answer everything in number 2, reporting what you observed, what you studied, what you found, what are some strategies that those people could have improved on if you noticed anything, or what you thought was really stellar. It's going to be at least about 500 words. The requirement is 350, but a general good response will be anywhere from 350 to maybe 500 to 600 words. So think about that. You will also need to include a scanned copy of your handwritten notes. So when I say scanned, it doesn't necessarily have to be scanned with a scanner. You could take a picture of it, upload it to your phone, email it to yourself, and send it to me as a JPEG when you submit the assignment. If you feel that your handwriting is really sloppy, then you can type up your notes and include it as that. But I need you to definitely identify within the body of your work the setting you observe them in, the type of people you observed, the date you observed, and then get to all of the requirements for the assignment. So there's going to be 3 of these throughout the semester. So if you have any specific requirements about the nature of this assignment, now is a good time to ask, because you could definitely start doing these ahead of time. You could definitely, after we complete this first one, if say next week when one's not due, but you're sitting in the break room and you see some really good interpersonal interaction going on, or some kind of interpersonal action at a meeting for work, you can definitely jot some notes down and save that and do that for the next one. So be thinking ahead always. Let me know if you have questions with this assignment. Discussion board number 3 asks you to look at page 113 and read a scenario in the try this section. It is the yellow section of the text right here. It is also listed in Blackboard. What you'll be doing is it gives you some information about culture, communication style, and feedback, and how communication style and feedback varies from culture to culture. The 2 questions you'll be answering are listed here in our presentation today, just so you can get some ideas. They are specific to the reading. I didn't include the blurb in here because it is on page 113. It is in Blackboard, and it's a lot of text. It would have been difficult to read during the lecture. But answer those 2 questions, provide textual support for your answers, and respond to at least 2 students with 150-word responses to each student. And your response should be about 300 words. So remember, we're looking at cultural differences in communication in this try this activity. So that's important to keep in mind. If you have questions with that, let me know. Just remember, your original response is due on Friday. Replies are due Sunday. I want to spend some time now looking at listening. Since chapter 4 deals with that, it's really important. You'll notice in chapter 4 they list a plethora of listening models and types of listening and what that means and things of that sense. We're going to go through some of them today. What I want to know is that there are typically 6 stages in listening steps in the Hearer model. You begin with hearing, then you move to understanding, remembering, interpreting, evaluating, and responding. Keeping that in mind, these particular types of listening really help us in understanding what it means when we appear to listen to one another. So appreciative listening really tells us we're listening for pleasure. That's watching a movie, listening to music, watching a TV show, anything like that, where listening is really just for pleasure and not necessarily to acquire any type of information or make an evaluation. It's just purely to just be entertained. Comprehensive listening is what we do like we're doing now in a lecture. It's when you are listening to gain some sort of knowledge about something, sitting in a meeting, things of that nature. The point is that you're acquiring knowledge. You're not necessarily making an evaluation. It's just to acquire knowledge or information about something. So our listening style tends to be comprehensive. We're in tune to gathering information and remembering it. Then we can move to the critical and deliberative stage of listening. This is where you may be listening to understand content or assess the reliability and or validity of some sort of message. It's where we are being more deliberative in our attempts to listen to something critically. This means that the text refers to things like, have you ever questioned the truth of the message or its usefulness or its reliability in the person delivering it? Anytime you question what you're listening to, you're utilizing critical or deliberative listening. And that doesn't necessarily mean that that's negative. It's not at all. It just means we're using and gathering information from the sender, their message from listening, to make an evaluation of some sort. The last stage is empathetic, and this is listening that really is for intrinsic reward or value. It's listening as a support to build relationships with others. Empathy in general is the ability to understand another's thoughts and feelings and to communicate that understanding to that person, as well as the ability to comprehend another person's point of view. So when we're applying empathy to listening, or we're being empathetic listeners, it's when we're trying to use listening as some type of therapeutic function for the sender, whoever's sending that message. So we're being a sounding board, we're listening to a friend, it facilitates problem solving, it lends to a different, clearer perspective in a given situation. Empathetic listening sometimes allows the sender, the person we're doing this with, to just have you be a sounding board and arrive at their answer to their problem just because you sat there. We all have situations where this is applied in our life, and so it's really important to keep that in mind. So those are some types of listening that we're going to be using going forward. This is a really good model to use for interpersonal observation report. What types of listening were you observing, and try to determine what the person was doing when you're watching these two people interact. Were they being empathetic? Or were they being critical, or was it comprehensive, or what maybe was it? And so that's really important to keep in mind. So that's one model that I definitely wanted to highlight. To kind of get into some ideas of culture's influence, this will help with your discussion board, is to look at the idea of dialogic listening. So dialogic listening involves a give and take between a person's interaction as they co-create a relationship. So it's important to know that listening plays a vital role in our social relationships with one another, and just as culture plays a part in our perception, so does listening. So it's important to know that attitude towards talk and silent plays a humongous role in how cultures perceive listening and speaking and things of that nature. So when we engage in dialogic listening, that's the process that occurs between people as they respond to one another in interpersonal interaction. It's important to know that this varies significantly from culture to culture, and this plays a part into our discussion board. So for example, in the United States, we practice people-oriented listening style, where we focus on feelings and concerns of individuals and interacting in the social aspects of those interactions. So we acknowledge by nodding, and we give feedback, and we may what be perceived as interrupt one another to help show them that we are engaged in the conversation, where interesting enough, Eastern cultures tend to practice speculative or metaphorical thinking where while listening, where this means that, like, reflecting in the sense from a Chinese perspective, they emphasize receiving the process over sending the process. So they demonstrate a lot of silence. So they sit there and they listen in their intent, and they give that person their full undivided visual attention while they're listening. They don't say anything until the very end. Where our interactive style and our people-oriented and engaging style in Western cultures tends to be significantly different. So it's really, really important to keep that in mind. So when people from Eastern cultures interact with people from Western cultures, it's listening between the lines that really occurs. This is really from a scholarly perspective, where a lot of scholars look at how well they do with listening to those and understanding the importance of that being left unsaid. So sometimes it's really important to kind of look at it from this perspective and see it, and that's where this discussion board comes in to help give you some more perspective on how you would adapt your feedback to show a dialogical listening perspective and what that means. So still adhering to your cultural norms, but respecting somebody else's cultural norms and what that plays within those situations. Moving forward to chapter 5, I want to highlight some things about language. So what you can see, these chapters really pair very well together, because we look at first listening and what that means to be people-oriented listeners, or what that means to listen for appreciation or critically or deliberative or whatever that may be. And now we need to move kind of into language and what that means when we express ourselves. So to roughly say, not roughly, but loosely just kind of come to agreement, it's important to know that we know language is a code or a system of arbitrary symbols shared by a group and used by its members to communicate with one another. So language is different depending on the culture. A culture will create a language or a code by which they communicate with. So it's really important to keep that in mind, and we know that, but it's important to know this trio of language codes. There's 3 types of codes within any given language. The synaptic code is the agreement to use the same symbols to communicate. So we agree in a given setting we're going to use the same symbols or whatever that may be. So in an oral language or a verbal language, we may agree that we're going to speak English or we're going to speak Spanish or whatever that may be. So you may know in the work setting that you're agreeing to speak English, but when you go home, you're going to speak another language, and that's your synaptic code, the agreement to communicate using the same symbols, meaning the actual code or system of language that's developed within your culture. A syntactic code is the agreement to use the same rules regarding word use. And this gets into the use of slang or colloquial language or language that is accepted to be the norm within a given cultural group. So sometimes we see teenagers and things of that nature speaking and using words in different ways that we may not apply the same meaning to, and that's their syntactic code. That's their agreement to use the same rules regarding word use. And so it's really important to keep in mind. That may be where groups tend to ignore grammatical rules, render or words incomprehensible or even nonsensical to those outside of that code or outside of that culture. And so it's important to know that you naturally, and these codes are naturally done, we intrinsically know how to do this, apply those into any given culture. So at work, we know we speak a certain way. That gets more into pragmatic, which segues into the third one. Our pragmatic code is the agreement to naturally consider the context of interaction, the nature of the relationship, and the goal of the exchange in deciphering meaning. What that loosely says is we apply 1 and 2, the synaptic code and the syntactic code, in a pragmatic way. Pragmatic code is the last step. So we know in any given context that we are going to speak a certain way. We know at work we use a certain language. At home we use language in a different way. With our friends we use language in a different way, and it goes forward from there. So we can apply that. We know we may speak more formally at work or use certain words and verbiage because that's delivering the customer service we need to deliver or whatever it may be, versus when I'm at home speaking with my husband, we may speak on our own way, speaking the same language, speaking English or whatever is your natural language that you use, but applying a pragmatic code to it, adapting our language. I'm not going to speak formally to my husband. I'm going to speak with more of an interpersonal connection and more level of intimacy, as opposed to when I speak to my child's teacher or when I speak to my friend that I've been friends with forever or whatever it may be. So understanding these trio of language codes really helps us in being able to identify the best listening and communication strategies with one another. With that, we can move into the triangle of meaning. This is where it helps us apply thought, word, and thing together. It's important to know that within the triangle of meaning, this was developed by Ogen and Richards, that the model uses a broken line to connect the word and the thing to which the word refers to. In a sense, what Ogen and Richards is telling us is the word is not the thing. There's no direct connection between the word and the thing that we're trying to apply meaning to. We have a thought and we have a word, but there's no direct connection. And what it gets at really in a nutshell is that meaning exists in thoughts, not in words and things. So when you say the word wealth, it does not necessarily mean the same thing to you as it does to another person. So I have an idea of what wealth means to me. You may have a different idea. When I have the idea of indulgence, what that means to me, I'm going to think something different than what you may think. And so what Ogen and Richards really tries to get us to get into is that their word is not the thing. We can't apply the same meaning to words. Naturally, meaning exists in thoughts. We apply thought to words or things or items or whatever it may be. So when I have a phone has I have different thoughts about a phone than you do. It may be used for physical phone sense of making phone calls and such and things like that. Other people may use their phone for other things, as a lifeline, as to communicate, as to work on, as to whatever it may be. So what Ojen and Richard tells us is in this triangle of meaning that thought connects words and things, that the word is not the thing and the thing is not the word. The meaning exists within a thought. So that's really, really important to understand, and the significance of this triangle when you're reading through the chapter. Really, you need to know that you must both attribute the same meaning to words being used. So there can be a communication error if I think wealth means something and you think it means something else, because we're applying our meaning and thought in a contextual perspective. And what ends up happening is we end up creating word masks or walls, meaning ambiguous language that is either meant to confuse on purpose or language that impedes understanding because our meaning exists in our thoughts. So we have differences in that, and it's important to understand that from that perspective. And so that's the triangle of of meaning. The next thing I wanted to show you is communication accommodation theory. That's also known as CAT. A lot of scholars just refer to it as CAT, and so we'll do that going forward. It's a theory that asserts that we adjust our language patterns to reflect how we feel about another person. And we do this through communication convergence or divergence. In a nutshell, it shows that within our interactions with one another, we automatically accommodate our communication. So we either move this towards a convergence, meaning that we reciprocate our communication if communication is going positively by matching the senders, so matching vocabulary, speaking rate, the use of pauses as a part of building a relationship, or will diverge, and communication divergence will occur where it will not match the sender and the purposeful adoption of style and speaking that contracts with the style of speaking of another person in a natural way to distance one another. Because you'll find in speaking and language and things of that nature, interpersonal interaction occurs all of the time. So maybe if I'm not getting my point across right in a situation with my child's teacher, I'm going to accommodate my language to divert from the way that the sender is speaking. So I may use more formal language, or I may be speaking in a different way, or a more forceful way, or a more purposeful way to get my point across, as opposed to speaking very naturally and adjusting my inflection of my voice and my rate of speaking and things of that nature to let the person know that I'm in tune and I'm interacting with them in a more casual way. So it's really important to keep that in mind. And that's what that is. Communication accommodation theory deals with the accommodation of our communication to adjust to the situation and to show either relationship building in the convergence factor or relationship separation in the divergence factor. Now, Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is a huge theory and contention within interpersonal communication. It's also known as culture speak. Really, this theory proposes that language influences perception by revealing and reflecting one's worldview, and that language is determined often by the perceived reality of a culture. It gets into some notions of Berger and Luxman's social construction of reality. It's already assuming that. So Berger and Luckman developed a theory that's saying reality is socially constructed based off of knowledge and observation. Sapir and Whorf tell us that language reveals social reality. So after we observe and construct reality socially by observation, our language will reveal that reality. And then in turn, our language will also influence perceptions by revealing and reflecting one's worldview. So the way we speak will show us what we view our social reality to be and reflect our worldview of whatever that may be. This is done usually through two things, or two ways to prove this. Is through linguistic determinism, where is the view that language shapes thinking, so the way we speak can shape the way that we think, and through linguistic relativity, the view that language contains unique embedded elements and that we use within it itself. And so really, this is a quote from Sapir, and I thought it was relevant to the situation, in which he states that the real world is to a large extent unconsciously built upon language habits of a group. No two languages are ever sufficiently similar to be considered as representing the same reality. The worlds in which different societies live are distinct worlds, not merely the same world with different labels attached. So he's saying our language creates little worlds within our social reality. And that gets into a lot of the things which we talked about with using semantic codes and types of listening and things of that nature. So Sapir and Wolf are telling us that within their hypothesis that we reveal what social reality is based off of what that the linguistic interaction is with one another in any given setting. So when I speak with my girlfriend that I've been best friends with for 20 years, our social reality is a lot different because we're using a lot of pre-existing knowledge and remembering how we were when we were teenagers. We may slip into speaking that way with one another versus how I may interact with a colleague at work or with my spouse. So the intimate language and interactions I use with my spouse, my husband, is going to reveal that social reality of what we have, and so on and so forth. And it goes from there. And so what Sapir and Worf are really getting into is that culture speaks. And our interactions speak and our culture comes out through language revealing what our social reality is. So how you interact with your parents is different than how you interact with your children. It's different how you interact with your coworkers and your spouse and your friends. And Sapir and Whorf are telling us is that this is all revealing multiple different social realities, and we move within these social realities at any given time. It also ties back to Goffman's dramaturgical analysis theory, which we reviewed a couple weeks ago, that tells us that we act in certain ways and we're mere actors presenting ourselves in many different ways anytime we interact with people interpersonally. So you can start to see where these theories play a role in interacting and going back and forth with one another. Going forward, I do want you to take note that we have multiple things due this week. Oops. And this is just to review. So remember, we're reading chapter 4 and 5, which we just went over. You have a couple different videos to watch. Get started early on your interpersonal observation report that's due on Sunday. And then don't forget that your discussion board original post is due Friday, and the reply posts are due on Sunday. If you have any questions, let me know. I am more than willing to reach out and help with you. I look forward to interacting with you all this week. Grades will be updated no later than Friday or so. Some of those critical reviews may take a little longer, but definitely towards the end of the week. And I hope you all have a blessed week. Also, do not forget to keep working on your midterm project that's due next week, where you're noting and correcting that interpersonal behavior you want to improve upon. If you need anything, just let me know, and I look forward to chatting with you online. God bless.